In looking at the firms that operate in the region and where they could go, we need to distinguish three kinds of firms. And I'm leaving out subsidiaries of foreign firms or foreign firms operating in the region. I'm thinking about CARICOM firms, and that is owned within the CARICOM region. Three kinds. There are what I call national CARICOM firms, which are nationally based, nationally owned. There are, secondly, trans CARICOM firms. Those are firms operating in several member states, may be owned nationally or even owned in more than one state. And finally, there are, however small in number and small in size, there are CARICOM multinational firms. And what we notice is that some of the larger national firms have evolved through the stage of trans CARICOM firms into CARICOM multinational firms. Some have even skipped the intermediary stage of trans CARICOM firms and gone straight to multinational configuration. The question is, as we incorporate the single market and economy, or at least the single market part of that equation, how is this going to assist the struggle for international competitiveness? It is envisioned that one of the functions of the CSME is to promote international competitiveness, and it is assumed that it will happen in the following way. That there are 5 results which it will produce, which will induce international competitiveness. One is the enlarged market should provide more opportunities for the attainment of economies of scale in more lines of production. 2, an enlarged pool of resources free to move across the region should lower cost and improve productivity. 3, the removal of monopoly status of firms in the national market to a regionally competitive market should induce some innovation and creativity. 4th, the intensification of competition in the regional market should produce some improved efficiencies, that is, internal efficiencies to the firm. And finally, the experience of exporting in the regional market is supposed to be valuable and preparatory to exporting in the global marketplace. I believe, though, that we need to focus much more on what impinges on the firms directly, and I believe one of the neglected areas is those things which affect investment, ownership, and the movement of capital. I think the integration movement has been preoccupied with trade liberalization, and that is unfortunate because it's not unusual for customs unions arrangements within developing countries not to create a great expansion in intra-regional trade. It is the other benefits which usually come, which involve investment and functional cooperation. Now, turning to the state of play in terms of the differences which have to be confronted. CARICOM firms, regardless of their configuration, are minute by comparison with the firms they have to compete with in the global marketplace. I'd like to pass around these which illustrate some of the differences, and I'll just draw 3 highlights. Grace Kennedy, the largest firm in the region in terms of revenue, is approximately 0.1% of Walmart's revenue. Or put another way, Walmart is nearly 600 times larger than Grace Kennedy. If we look at the comparisons in assets, we will find that Allianz Worldwide of Germany has assets which are 328 times larger than NCB of Jamaica, the largest firm in the region in terms of assets. And if you compare NCB with Citibank, you will find that Citibank is 450 times larger. If we look at employment, and we look at this simply because it's a common definition of what a firm is, the size of a firm. Neil and Massey and Lasser's Democrat with over 6,000 employees are a drop in the bucket compared to General Motors or Walmart, who have well over 600,000 employees. So these differences are gigantic, and you're going to put all of these corporate entities on a level playing field in the FTAA or in the multilateral trade system. Now, our dilemma is even worse because we have these nano firms. If you look at the definition of a small firm, in Europe they use 300 employees, in the US they use 500 employees, and in developing countries they have often proposed 200 employees. If you use any of these cutoff points, we have nano firms. If you use 500 employees, there are about 40 or 50 CARICOM firms that could meet that definition. But the average firm is much smaller than that. For example, 85% of the firms engaged in exporting, and those are usually the larger firms, have less than 200 employees. The second dimension of these nano firms is not only that they are minute by global standards, but when they have to operate in a small developing economies, there are a second set of disadvantages, and these include the following: lack of economies of scale and scope, barriers to entry, weak infrastructure, inability of governments to provide resources or other forms of support. Imports cost more because they're in a small economy. There are price takers in the global marketplace. There's an absence of clusters of other firms producing the same thing. And there is also the fact that it cannot draw on an environment where there are other firms which can complement support, where it can have strategic alliances. For example, a small firm in the United States is in an entirely different economic setting than a small firm in a small developing economy. Hence, nano firms.